think there's a sense that, every year is complicated and that we're surrounded by complexity and risk and difficult situations. Is 2024 simply a continuation of that trend, or is there something different about this year? We welcome your thoughts.
Great question to start with. So, most risk experts think in terms of numbers of risks, the likelihood of those risks and the impact. So it's kind of number, likelihood, impact. What makes 2024 different is in each of those measures, there are more risks, they are more likely to take place, and there are more high impact risks. So whether you're talking about the US election and how that plays out, US-China relations, the Middle East, Russia-Ukraine, technology, etc., this year is fundamentally different. Certainly, I've been working in geopolitics for 25 years. This is the first year where you start the year going, okay, this is a year to watch. What I would say, though, is it would be very easy to think that's all downside risk.
Yeah.
It isn't. There's a fair amount of upside risk. So just to take one, let's take the Middle East for a moment. Right at the moment, it looks pretty dire.
Yeah.
But there is movement, and in that dynamism, actually you could get some positive outcomes along with what are clear negative outcomes that we've already seen to date. So it's not all downside risk, but it is risk.
Well, I think there's always that juxtaposition of risk and opportunity.
Exactly.
And I guess a theme, or rather a question that I'll pose to you perhaps towards the end of our conversation again is how do these issues play out, at the organisational level, at the enterprise level? But I'll park that one for now.
I've got an answer for you.
Good. I'm glad you got an answer to that one, because that's how we want to end it.
Excellent. Okay.
So before we sort of get into a number of the issues that you've already mentioned, I just want to, I guess this is more of a hypothetical, or again, and this is taking slightly advantage of the fact that you and I both worked in risk for 20 plus years. Is one of the factors that plays now the sheer volume of data, the sheer quantity of information that we receive on a daily basis, the speed with which now information and arguably misinformation moves around the world? How much of that is a factor that almost makes us feel like we are living in a more risky, more volatile world?
So kind of what you're talking about is the distinction between perception and reality.
Correct.
So let me give you kind of two-part answer. The first part is the speed, which I think is a really important point, which is we are moving faster today than we ever have. Perhaps more importantly than that, we are moving slower today than we ever will. Just think about that. I mean, that's a really profound thought. We are moving slower today than we ever will. So, if you're sitting in corporates, you have to accept the fact that this is only going to get harder to manage. This is only going to get faster. So that's kind of point one. That's a really important point. The second point is it just perception that we see more and therefore, and there's clearly an element of that, but it's not only perception, it is also reality. And what you're seeing today, you used the word complexity earlier. The complexity has risen. So if you combine misinformation, disinformation, fake news with the fact that approximately half of the globe is going to vote this year, those two things combined make for a very complex situation. And we don't yet have the systems in place to effectively moderate the consequences of disinformation with an awful lot of elections. That's still very much in process, and the big question is it going to be regulated by government? Is it going to be regulated by the private sector, etc.? Still an open question. But it gets to your point about complexity. So there's no question, just to close that loop down, there's absolutely no question at all that it is reality.
Yeah.
There might be perception laid on top of that.
As we started the year, and I know we're already sort of all well into it, what were the big themes? What are the big themes that you that you saw that are going to be, I guess, central to the evolution of 2024?
Sure. So I like to think of it, and this again, thinking particularly, I work with a lot of corporates, thinking particularly of like, how do I help them think about the world? So I think of it less in terms of lots of issues and more of actually how do we create a framework in which you can think about them. And so the framework that I use is a house, a building. And you have the foundations on which, the fundamental architecture of the building that affects whether it's a swimming pool or it's a home or it's an office.
Yep.
You have the systems, the plumbing, the electricity, and then you have the rooms.
Yep.
And so on the foundational side, the things that I'm watching, and these are things that fundamentally affect the character of how the world is going to play out this year. And I'm not going to go into details, but it's things like the energy transition and climate change, technology, both upside downside, economics, changing societal attitudes.
Yep.
All of these are kind of fundamental, and demographics, five fundamental foundational things that are affecting the underlying character of the building.
And there are a couple of those which I'm definitely going to come back to, particularly that one on societal changes.
Okay.
Because I think as we go through this conversation, there are, and as we apply it, I guess, to the day-to-day realities of living and working and running organisations, that those societal shifts for me are fascinating. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, not at all. And they're fascinating, but they're also the ones that, in my experience, corporates are all over the E of ESG.
Yeah.
They're not knowing how to handle the S. And you're seeing this again and again, particularly in the United States, Disney, etc. We've got lots of examples of where corporates just are mishandling the S. So I think it's a great place to dig in. So that's the foundation. And then you've got the, what I'm calling the systems, the plumbing, the electricity, and that's US elections, that's US-China relations, that's what's going on in the Middle East, and that's Russia-Ukraine. Those are the big things that something happening in one of those spaces will affect the globe, but they're not foundational. And then you've got, what I call the rooms that are much more localized, and that's the approximately half of the global population going to vote. So you've got, voting system, you've got civil strife around the world, lots of it in Africa, Latin America, and that affects a localized space. You've got what's going on in North Korea. That's kind of interesting. And then you have severe weather events. And those to me they're relatively small, they're localized. Now, if lots of those happen at the same time, that then has broader consequence. And one of the big questions for me this year, and then I'll stop, is the global governing system up for the complexity that we're living in this year?